Um, Again, my name is James Demetriou, Head of General Insurance Claims at Zurich, Australia, New Zealand, and I'm joined, sorry about that.
James is joined by me, Julie Morgan. Good afternoon, everybody.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, sensitive mouse, so it's moving a bit quicker than I'd like to. So yes, Julie Morgan, Head of our Technical Claims, specialising in professional indemnity and public liability. So I'll be tackling the first part of the presentation focused on material damage. And again, the theme of the presentation today and what we'd like you to walk away with is a better understanding in terms of the interplay between material damage covers, public liability and professional indemnity covers, and we'll have an opportunity at the end for any questions. So, but please send through your questions as we go through the presentation. Thank you. Okay, so again, focusing on material damage in terms of what we're covering today. So again, from a background, so construction is of course a major part of Australia's landscape, whether it's homes and high rises to accommodate our growing population, the roads, rail and highways and airports and ports that connect us all, the mining and production and manufacturing facilities that create our wealth, and also our schools, hospitals and aged care services that support our communities. When it comes to insurance claims, in recent years, we've seen a growing interplay between the different covers and are much more pronounced, particularly as projects become more involved and complex. Today, we'll be looking at general concepts covering material damage policies, liability, and professional indemnity policies. We won't be specifically looking at construction insurance arrangements, for example, the arrangements under annual policies or project-specific covers. And we won't, through the presentation, but happy to pick up in Q&A, looking at types of construction projects such as alliance projects or joint venture projects. And likewise, we'll have some really good examples through the presentation. But again, I'm not specifically focusing on any particular project types, but happy again to take any questions going forward. So to kick off the material damage discussion, it's really important to know who is insured under a construction policy. And it's really important to look not only at the persons actually named and listed as named insureds in a schedule, but also the definition of an insured. Lots of you would have experience in this area, and as you know, commonly these policies will include a broad catchment of parties that are defined insureds. And it normally will extend to include the principal or owner, the main contractor doing the works, the subcontractor, the consultants used to design and put together the project, and sometimes even subcontractors. When it comes to consultants, and again, this is an important aspect that Julie will touch on as well, is consultants' basis as an insurer on the policy is normally confined to the activities they do on site versus the activities they do off-site. By having multiple parties as insured under the policies, it does and can allow for situations where you have any one or more of the parties lodging claims for loss. And it's really important again to turn to the terms of the construction policy in terms of how that can work in practice. We have seen develop over time clauses in both the construction contract and often in wordings as well that provide clarity about who has the first right to lodge a claim, how that process should work, and really importantly, who has the benefit of monies paid out under the policy. In terms of what the policy benefits under material damage provide cover for, they extend to cover the costs of demolition and removal of debris, own repair and reconstruction of damage, associated consultants' fees, expediting costs, and importantly include allowances for the builder's profit margin and overheads. And where overheads will include things like mobilisation and setup costs. Usually, and different to say a standard property or ISR program, the insured will do the repair themselves, or the owner will arrange repairs. And it's very rare you'll have a situation where an insurer will bring in their own panel builder to do the works. Also, really importantly, there's been over the years an allowance for more acute mitigation and make safe costs to prevent further damage arising out of a covered damage event. And Julie in the PI section will talk a little bit about mitigation covers in professional indemnity and third-party claims. Going now into the triggers for cover and some key concepts. Again, the material damage section has been known by different names over the years, and CAR, or contractors all risk, is a common name for contract works cover, but it's actually quite a appropriate name, because the policy does normally provide cover for all risks of damage or loss to the property. Okay, and the focus here is damage to the property. So from the claims perspective, we're looking at damage to the property insured and the cause of that, and not so much allocation of responsibilities or fault by parties. First and foremost, we're looking at damage to the insured property. Which brings me to sort of the next standard question is, what is insured? What are the construction works that are being insured? They have a temporal element, as well as a physical and an ownership element. So the works have a start and an end date, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. But in terms of what actually constitutes the construction works, that is always clearly defined in the policy in terms of what is insured works property. It would normally include the materials brought, obviously built into the site, but also brought onto the site waiting to get used in the construction works. And again, normally will extend to plant and equipment being used on the site. It can also often include materials the owner has arranged for to be installed in the site. And examples of these are in sort of manufacturing plants, where the owner may have processing equipment of its own that it wants installed in the final completion, or things even like IT systems that the owner has arranged as opposed to the main contractor. One area of, to monitor is existing property. So when you're doing works that are a renovation or a refurbishment, for example, refurbishing a hotel or a school, the contractor will be working on an existing structure. And these structures, and again, the wording will define this, are typically not insured construction works properly. The insured works are the works that are being done and introduced into the school, for example, the refurbishment or the extension, and doesn't necessarily extend automatically to that existing property. So something to keep an eye on for those types of jobs. And again, the key trigger for cover that we always look for in the claims team under the material damage is physical damage to the works. And again, that will be talked about a bit later in a really good example that Julie has regarding some concrete defects. So again, the key thing we look for there is that physical damage to work. Timing is interesting as well. So as long as the damage to the works can be traced back to something that occurred in the construction policy period, and I'll talk about those periods in a second, we do often get claims after the projects have been finished and handed over. But again, we are looking for damage to the works, and also to show that that damage occurred during that construction period, even if it hasn't been identified immediately. And it goes without saying, when things go wrong and your customer lets you know there's been some damage or manifesting or occurring at a project, to let the insurer know as soon as possible, so they can arrange for the necessary inspections and the evaluations of the loss, and then move as speedily as they can towards confirming cover and assisting the insured in terms of how to progress the repairs and claims process. As I mentioned before, there's also a temporal element to the construction works. They have a start and a finish date, and that's called, not surprisingly, the construction period. Again, from a general concepts perspective, the period starts when the works are commenced and all the way through to completion. And there's always a completion event or trigger, and it's often called a date of practical completion, when the owner effectively takes the keys to the finished project. Construction periods can obviously go for many years, and when you're talking about major infrastructure projects, that can go on for more than 10 years. But in sort of the normal, say, residential or accommodation type constructions, again, from a claims perspective, one sort of cautionary point is delays to project completions, because they may create underwriting concerns if the project completion gets extended for continuous periods. Again, something to raise, make aware with your customers, and obviously raise with your underwriters as well if there are changes to the construction period. You can, again, more and more with more complex projects, have situations where part of projects are completed and handed over to the owner, and part is still under construction. We see examples like this readily. So where you have mixed retail at the base of a high-rise construction, often that mixed retail, those shops are opened up early and the apartments above are still under construction, and you have a situation where part of the project is handed over to the owner and part of the project is still under construction and under the care responsibility of the main contractor. The level of loss exposure naturally grows over time as the project progresses, and as more materials and values are brought up onto the site. On the flip side though, some element of the projects become less risky. The project may become more resilient to things like adverse weather, as a building, for example, is closed up or roads are sealed. From a claims perspective, our worst case scenarios, and customers as well, is major damage towards the end of a project, when there's high values and a repair and process is much more involved than if something happened early on. Again, I've had examples of this myself, with a situation where a major university was having an extension, had a small fire. It was contained, so the fire itself didn't damage a big part of the works, but the fire response and the water damaged quite a bit of the works. And at that stage, the university had installed a lot of its high-end IT, learning IT, and also a lot of architectural fixtures and finishes to the work. So the water damage element was actually quite severe because of the stage of the project. And we also had quite an unusual one where a project was actually finished, just about finished, and a government building, and the department owners wanted to add a new floor on the high rise, which was allowable and doable. But to do that, the builder had to open up all the services on the roof to start that type of extension work. And as timing would have it, a major storm came through once those openings had been exposed, and the high rise was filled with storm water. So again, building near completion where you think it'd be resilient to things like storm and perils, but again, suffering a major storm damage event. The second part of the policy period is called the defects liability period. And this is a contractual period where the builder has promised and is required to come back and fix any defects that are identified as part of the works. It's normally a defined time period, often 12 months, but can be longer for bigger projects. And the material damage policy extends the time period of cover for this defects liability period. But it actually only allows certain types of damage events to be covered. So damage that's referable to a construction process that happened in the construction period, or if whilst the contractor is on site dealing with a defect rectification and causes damage to the works. Probably a useful example to sort of delineate this is a waterline failure in a high-rise apartment. Again, one of our worst-case scenarios, to have a waterline failure in a high-rise apartment that trickles down and damages multiple floors. So that type of event could occur during installation when the high-rise is still being built and could cause damage. It could occur after the completion and the project's been handed over, but when we investigate it, we can see that the cause of that failure of the line was a defect in the construction period. Or you could have a situation where the builder has had to come back to do some works after it's been the project's been finished, and damages a line in the course of those works, and then causes damage to the work. So again, a bit of an example as to when the defects liability period can trigger in the material damage policy. But 9 times out of 10, the damage occurs in the policy period, or is clearly identified pretty shortly thereafter. And whilst we'll all like to think construction progress go to the best laid plans, sometimes they don't. And so let's probably talk to one of the most controversial parts of material damage cover, which is the defects section. Again, this is an aspect of the policy cover that often gives rise to disagreements. From a claims perspective, the easiest claim you get is where there's been a water damage or a theft event or a fire event or an impact event. And it's always not as straightforward when something breaks or falls or cracks or collapses, and there needs to be some work to understand what's occurred there. Again, it's not so much a fault-finding exercise for the purposes of the material damage cover. It's really about identifying physical damage has occurred. That's again the mainstay for the material damage cover. Over the years, to tackle defects occurring and leading to damage, some clauses have been, and underwriting approaches have been developed, and they form parts what you see in policies called the defects exclusions. From the intention perspective here, we start off on the basis that defects are a controllable risk, and fundamentally the main contractor, the constructor and the owner are best placed to manage that risk by having really good and solid designs, really good workmanship, and really good experienced subcontractors and practitioners applying best practice on construction standards and behaviours to make sure the works are done to a good plan and in good quality. But recognising this doesn't always occur, and damage to works can occur due to design defects and workmanship causes. Again, we've had some exclusions developed over time. And these exclusions recognise the reality that fixing the damage that's occurred can include both a repair of that damage, but also a redoing of that faulty workmanship or that design that's contributed or caused the damage. In terms of which exclusion clause and breadth of defects cover is included in a wording, it really depends on insurers' risk appetite and to a lot of the times the complexity of the project. So for example, building a residential home or a high-rise normally has a lower design risk than say a major tunnelling project. Having said that, you may have the best tunnelling builder in the world, so they may be a better risk than maybe a builder who's doing their first ever high-rise construction. The exclusions, the way they're structured and approached, they normally start off with a blanket exclusion for defect and design workmanship costs. And then they have carve-outs that allow for certain outcomes. And I've given at a really high level 3 sort of the common span of versions, and you do get some variance in between. So the first version doesn't allow for any claim for any works costs that are referable to rectifying a defect or faulty workmanship, and only focus on any subsequent damage costs. But again, a lot of the times when things go wrong, the cost to fix has got both those subsequent damage costs and also defect and faulty workmanship fixes. The second version provides a bit more cover, and it allows for the cost of those the defects that would have been necessary immediately prior to the loss occurring, which is a bit of a notional assessment. I'll talk to you a bit later as to how we often try and tackle that. What would have been the cost immediately before the loss occurred for the purposes of this type of clause. The third clause is sort of the most expansive or more expansive clause, which only excludes that cost of improving the design or the faulty workmanship. So effectively allows for the cover of the subsequent damage, the cost to redo the same design or redo the same faulty workmanship, and only excludes the cost to improve that design or that workmanship. Again, there's always a need for material damage to exist, and that box on the left sort of talks to a standard a clause that you'll see in a lot of the wordings, that just because something is found out to have a defect within it, but not damaged yet, doesn't make it damaged. So we're always, for the material damage section, looking for something to be physically damaged. And again, Julie will talk regarding how liability and professional indemnity policies may play a role in those type of defects without damage scenarios. Often when things go wrong, there's a lot of people scratching their heads and wondering why something's cracked, fallen, or collapsed. You often, again, people being people, don't normally get someone putting up their hands straight away to say the design's wrong or the work's been done badly, and it does take a bit of time to get to the bottom of what's gone wrong. And often you have to look past that and see how the damage is looking to get repaired to give you a really good indicator of maybe what the contributing factors to the loss have been. So I personally often ask that question of understanding. It's very difficult to understand what's contributed to, or if there might be multiple causes to something being damaged and it's not that manifest. But I always sort of look to what's being replaced. How are we fixing the damage? Are we fixing it in a different way, a different approach, a different design? Are we putting in a bigger beam, a different connection or fitting, or a thicker foundation than what we did last time? They're often good questions that the claims team ask themselves, and ensure to understand maybe what's contributed from a defect and a faulty workmanship perspective. So again, probably the most contentious one, a very complicated one. And again, often there isn't a standout reason as to why something's gone wrong and sustained damage. And Julie's got a fantastic example there. Again, that closes out that material damage section. Again, looking forward to Q&A and questions on any of the topics covered here, or any other things you've got on your mind regarding construction risks claims. I'll now hand over to Julie, our expert in all things liability and professional indemnity, to talk to some of the interplay with construction claims.
Great, thanks, James. I'm just taking control here of the webinar, just checking. Yep. It's working. Great. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Yes, thanks, James. And hello to everyone joining today. I'm the head of technical claims at Zurich. So I have oversight over large and complex claims, many of which we're seeing these overlapping coverage issues arise in. And that is the same for all value claims in construction industry experience that we're having. So now I'll commence the part of the presentation where we compare the coverage sections. We call out the interplay and we describe the potential for overlap. So firstly, I'd like to commence with the comparison between contracts works and the general liability policies. So the key areas of difference is that one is first party and the other is third party. And the second key area is the fault factor, which you also heard James talk about and reference in the first section of this presentation. So like all liability policies, it covers the insured when a third party alleges you've done something wrong. And that's in the insuring clause. What you did wrong by their allegation is caused property damage. So we're only dealing with little Roman numeral 2 in this insuring clause on the screen. That then compares to the contract works policy, which James discussed, where cover is for damage to property. So both of those policies have the same effect. They're covering property damage. An example that we've had is a Zurich insured is a construction company. It's on an infrastructure project, and it's very common for us to see other property owned and controlled by others affected by the work being carried out. So the example was in a claim that we've been involved in is the construction company is working the electricity, they're repairing a length of cabling, they turn off the electricity to fix the problem cables. On turning back on, a mistake happens and this makes the switch blow. So there's damage to property, and that was covered by a liability policy, whilst there was also a contract works and project specific policy in place which had cover in relation to the cables. So if I go now to what we need to do about that. So insurers use the exclusions to remove this double up of cover. So we're trying to exclude the cover that should be available under another risk. So the first example of that excludes property damage during a building contract or a project when an insured is a contracting party bearing the responsibility. The second here is an example of excluding completed projects and product liabilities for the defects or the deficiency, but not any consequential loss. So they're the covers that James has spoken to. So contract works covers should be excluded from a liability policy is what these are trying to achieve. The third example there is liabilities in the market tend to exclude design errors. However, some offer write-backs for the extent that there's been property damage. So this is done to try and ensure that the right risk is being picked up, which is the cost of fixing property damage that the liability policy affords. These suite of policies should sit side by side with no overlap, but in reality, they don't dovetail as seamlessly in construction industry claims. So I think we need to understand and take away that there's numerous variations to the wordings and the way that they try to exclude other risks out in the market. So over to professional indemnity policies. So this is a common insuring clause for a design and construct PI policy. Construction entities clearly need a wording that is made for the industry so that it's the right fit. This insuring clause requires a civil liability, and it also requires a third-party claim, which is defined in each policy and differs slightly over different insurers' products. But generally across the industry, it requires that there's a written demand for monetary damages or proceedings that have been issued against the insured. The overlap doesn't arise here in relation to the professional indemnity policies. The property damage is not contemplated and it's not defined and not intended to be covered under a professional indemnity policy. Like the two other policies that we've touched upon previously. What we're covering here is professional services of an insured. So it's important to go next to the extensions, because the extensions is where we find the real issues in relation to overlap for PI. The first is a hold harmless extension. So this works in a situation where an engineering company, for example, we insure, might have a role in the contractual chain that indemnifies the principal contractor for any claims arising from its professional services. or it subsequently goes and contracts with another specialist, a load-bearing company, for example, who has a hold harmless terms in the provision of that service. So these will still be covered risks, on the basis that the liability arises out of the professional services. More importantly, in the extensions and where we see the overlap consistently arising is the loss mitigation and rectification clause. This is where the property damage really can be covered. So the cover is being given to rectify what would otherwise become a claim under the insuring clause. So for this type of industry, the largest risk is design errors. The owner, whether it's a residential owner, a commercial or a mixed owner of a property or a property being built, is always asking for the design to work and to be fit for purpose. So here we can give an example of how the overlap behaves. So this is a case study we've been involved in, and it really demonstrates a good example, we think, of how this occurs in practice. So our insured enters into a design and construct contract to build a 17-storey apartment building, which also includes the promise to design and construct it in a manner that is fit for purpose. The insured then engages multiple parties to do parts of the work. This is the contractual chain. And for the purposes of this claim, we had the design and construct company. They enter into a contract with the design group to design the concrete floor slabs. That design group then enters into a contract with the construction group to design the formwork and the propping. That construction group enters into a contract with a working group who orders the concrete, puts in place the formwork and propping, and pours the concrete. And they would have contracted with a concrete company to supply the company. So there's 5 entities, obviously, in that contractual chain. The design and construct entity takes out a contract works policy for the project with one insurer, and then they also have an annual PI policy with another. The building starts going up, it's all fine, until level 5, something changes, something happens differently, but it's not noticed until 6 floors have been poured and set. There is concrete deflection across all 6 floors. So instead of having beautifully flat floors, there are bumps and lumps and deflection all over 6 of those 17 floors ultimately. They have contractual time pressures for completion. So they immediately go ahead and start fixing things. Wisely, they notify their contract works insurer. Then it starts getting expensive. $14 million worth of expensive has occurred in this loss. The contract works insurer then declines the claim. When this happens, it's done on the basis that there was not damage to any other property, and the damaged property itself was caused by design error, and that they saw no other probable cause. So once that happened, the design and construct company notified its PI insurer. Zurich was that PI insurer. And all the work had been done and no root cause had been presented to us. The PI initially declines on the basis of a later to be misguided expert opinion that guided insurers to the view that construction management wasn't a professional service, and that those activities in question, the slab design, were merely construction works, and that could not be connected to a professional services. That expert was later fired. Another expert was put onto the job, and there commenced a very protracted investigation after the event to understand who caused this and which policy it fits under. Zurich covered this under the mitigation of loss extension cover on the basis it could preserve its rights to make a dual insurance claim and subrogation rights to all those involved in that contractual chain. So we pay the claim within 2 years and takes about another 2 years. So 4 years later, we finally have clarity on who caused what. So we identified in this claim that there were 3 causes to the loss, and the reason why we have to investigate this after the event is so that we can understand who in that 5-party contractual chain was responsible. Firstly, it was the specification for thin slabs. So it was determined that the thinness of the slabs weren't suitable, and they were just short of relevant standards. So that thinness was important to take into account then for all of the others in the chain when designing propping sequencing. So the design of that thinness was the responsibility of the design group. So that's the first party to look to subrogate to. Secondly, the defective design of the propping and formwork methodology. So that was the role of the construction group. That was their design. The design meant that whole sections of formwork had to be taken down before the propping could be reinstated, and that had to come off so it didn't overweight the slabs, leaving relatively thin slabs unsupported for periods of time. So both the design group for specifying an unworkable type of propping, and then the working group for not following the propping design instructions. Thirdly, there was improper removal of the propping and formwork prior to the slabs reaching their specified hardness. Zurich's experts were finally able to conclusively determine this was the result of construction errors, which would also fall into the caused by the working group. So this sees us in a very large recovery situation, having effectively fronted the $14 million worth of loss due to the fact that the design and construct group has contractual liability for its subcontractors to the owner. So one important point when thinking about this example is that the different types of contract works policies offer different levels of cover, and that sits nicely with how James described. Some of them are expansive, some of them are much more reduced in cover. So it's not always going to be the case in this type of claim that the contract works would have excluded it, which also added to the level of difficulty in understanding which policy really should be picking up this damage in the first instance. Very important to keep that distinction in mind, that there's going to be variations, that some contract works will cover and some won't. The next important point that we get reminded by this example is the fault factor. So the PI policies offer this valuable protection to entities with the point of view from the contract works policy being no fault, and also it can give a waiver of subrogation clauses. So from an insured's perspective, when you're thinking about where to notify and where to seek cover, to access cover in the first instance, the contract works policies can be an easier path because of that no fault issue, and if it just wants the claim done and out of the way, it's something to keep in mind because it may protect, the principals policy may protect those in the contract chain. So I might go back to, go back to the wording at this point. As we talked about in the GL policy, the PI policies generally try to exclude loss that should be picked up in other policies as well. So in the PI policy, there are exclusions that do that. They don't cover the insured's profits, their bonuses or incentives. They're not covering any betterment in quality or standard, and they're not covering any acceleration costs. So they're the examples in the PI PI policy. So back to the potential overlaps that we see. We've been talking about overlaps for an insured, but the contractual chain that I've described also has numerous policies of the type we're discussing. So for example, on a construction risk project, the owner may have a general liability policy. The design and construct contractor may have one, and a major subcontractor may also have one. So also consultants as well. So contractual obligations in arranging insurance and who has those obligations can have a major impact on which policies may respond and which entities can claim on policies. So we're considering here double insurance or dual insurance issues as soon as reasonably practical. In appropriate cases, contractors and consultants should seek to argue that the principal should exhaust the rights on the construction risk policy, which I touched upon in the last slide, before claiming on the contractors and consultants, because you do need to look to whether or not there's a waiver of subrogation in the principal's policies. Further examples of overlaps, going back to this concept of fault, it's really important to remember when a claim is brought to you, this policy will fix the damage straight away. The contract works, fixes the damage. So keep in mind that regardless of fault piece, which makes it an easier claim, they do not cover the item. So generally, they won't cover the item that's defective by reason of the design or the workmanship, but they do cover the consequential loss or damage. The contract works policies also have the benefit of usually have a lower deductible than general liability or public or professional indemnity, and often they have a higher limit of liability as well. So given the car policies are no fault and include waiver of subrogation clauses, if an insured wants to be over, then it is an easier path. So as we mentioned before, it's the mitigation cover in the PI policy that creates the overlap. The mitigation cover is very generous. It's almost unrestricted in scope. So often the contractual indemnities between the parties will be narrower, and it's in everybody's interest to make sure that subrogation rights can be exercised to get a part of that money back that may be more expansive in the mitigation cover that's provided. So questions to consider when you have an insured come to you with a loss. When they bring the claim, I think one of the most important parts to start with is understanding the facts. Then you need to have some type of checklist similar to this. This is a very summary version, but I think we've talked about what most of these issues are, so I won't repeat them all here. But this is a list that might provide some assistance. You need to clearly look up and down that contractual chain to see what other policies might happen to name the various entities. Often underwriters, particularly liability underwriters, seem to be quite happy to include in a definition of insured the principals or subcontractors to the extent that they're working on that project. And that's a very easy dual insurance, easy money for the contractor's point of view to attach to as opposed to their own policies. Next is a fitness for purpose piece. We talked about that in the meaning as between the contracting parties, but also in relation to the outcomes of the claim. It's quite a legalistic position that's mentioned here, but something to keep in mind is that it doesn't come up in coverage as much, or coverage debates, but it will come up in disputes if they're resolved before litigation, because there's different covers for contract compared to tort. So that's one to keep in mind as well. Often mitigation cover, another example of an experience, often that mitigation cover will be triggered without knowing the exact cause, as in the concrete example that I gave you. If an insured can make out that it's facing a claim and the nature of that claim can fit within the activities of the insured, then the mitigation cover can be triggered, even though how did this happen is still unexplained. It's a fact that it's happened and we're liable for a professional indemnity reason that would be sufficient to trigger the cover. So it's really important for you to not decide immediately which policy responds, but to give notice to all, because understanding of who caused what can change and usually does change with time when it's a very complex factual mix. And then it can be a pivoting of which policies might respond. So a short summary here, just to try and wrap up for you. The understanding, I think the picture that we've given here today is that these claims involve multiple parties with lots of different roles. There's multiple policies that are at play and multiple risks. So with that comes a lot of complexity. We see these complexities constantly. We have to get solutions to those messy problems. It's a part of what we do. So insureds come to us when something has gone wrong. So reach out to us, come to us, work with us, and we look forward to solving these complex claims with you.